We must soon cross the river, the Mississippi that is. The eastern frontier was the fertilizer that spread across the North American West. So much of the minutiae of the stories of the hardy characters that made the coasts, then the foothills, mountains, and rivers home are as fascinating and borderline plausible as the generalizations and asides presented in Volume 1. Whole books have already been written and stories recorded that cannot practically be recounted here. The men and women, both foreign and native, who birthed a new generation of explorers and settlers are too numerous to give full attention to. Adventurers, hunters, homesteaders, and home wreckers included the likes of Dan and Rebecca Boone, David Crockett, Simon Kenton, James Smith, John Harris, Christopher Gist, Rufus Putnam, the renegade Simon Girty and his brothers, George Rogers Clark, Sam McCulloch, Mary Inglis, Mary Jemison, Elizabeth Zane, the water-bearing women of Bryan's Station, John Sevier, James Robinson, and many other remarkable individuals. Among Eastern Indians, renowned tribal sachems or war chiefs include Joseph and Molly Brant, Cornstalk, Little Turtle, Tarhay, Red Jacket, Logan, Osceola, Billy Bowlegs, Wildcat, Tecumseh, Nancy Ward, and unnamed squaw sachems. But reluctantly, I must let the gaps in that narrative go in order to move on to even more remarkable tales, factual and exaggerated, that were told by the settlers of the farther west. We must follow the Lewis and Clark path of discovery across the West. But first, I conclude my review of the pioneer and frontier events that were mostly east of the Mississippi River in the U.S., already outlined in Volume 1 and previously here in Volume 2. And I do so paraphrasing and repeating some observations made by Theodore Roosevelt in his tightly packed 4-volume book, The Winning of the West, published at the end of the 19th century. Teddy Roosevelt is yet another giant of Western lore, although a latecomer, a rough rider, a rancher in the Dakotas, a governor, an assistant secretary of the Navy, was the 26th president of the U.S., and also an author. How he had time to write books is a mystery. He was the youngest president in American history, helped broker the conclusion of the Russo-Japanese War, and became the first American to win a Nobel Prize in 1906. He also explored a remote Amazon river, spectacles and all, where he almost died. In the peninsula of East Florida,
a place of cypress, palmetto, live oak, open savanna, of sandy pine forest, and impenetrable, interminable morasses,
Roosevelt opined that the Spaniards established small colonies that were already, quote,
moldering in slow decay.
Quaint St. Augustine was founded years before the Dutch ship Half Moon in 1609 entered the Hudson River, quote, or the ships of the Puritans sighted the New England coast. St. Augustine's harbor once was filled with huge ships and billowing sails of the Spanish war vessels. When the fleets of the Catholic king gathered there before setting out against the seaboard towns of Georgia and the Carolinas in order to block inroads of the English colonists. Early on, their priests and soldiers had brought the Indian tribes under subjection and dotted the wilderness with fort and church and plantations. However, Roosevelt writes that the tide of Spanish success had turned and begun to ebb many years before the English took possession of Florida. The Seminole warriors fought on foot and on horseback and had avenged in countless bloody fights with some other tribes that no longer existed. Under Spanish rule, churches and forts were crumbling into nothing, half buried in the rotting mold. The deserted plantations and untraveled causeways no longer marred the face of the swampy land, for even the great high road that led to Pensacola had faded away, overgrown by the rank, luxurious, semi-tropical forest. Beyond the Chattahoochee and the Apalachicola to the Mississippi and its delta lay the more prosperous region of West Florida, although taken by the English from Spain. There were a few Spaniards among the people who were controlled by the small British garrisons stationed at Pensacola, Mobile, and Natchez. Rather, the inhabitants were mainly French Creole or Cajun.
They were an indolent, pleasure-loving race, fond of dancing and merriment, living at ease in their low, square, roomy houses. Their black slaves worked for them. They sometimes spent much of their time in fishing and fowling.
In the part of West Florida lying along the east bank of the Mississippi, some French Creole and a few Spaniards lived with Negroes and Indians to boot, but the population consisted mainly of Americans from the old colonies. These frontier folks came by sea in small sailing vessels, or had descended the Ohio and the Tennessee in flatboats, or had crossed Creek Indian country with pack ponies, following the narrow trails of the native traders. When Louisiana was ceded to Spain, most of the French Creole were clustered together in the delta. The rest scattered out on a line up the left bank of the river to the Missouri, near the mouth of which there were several small villages like St. Louis, St. Genevieve, St. Charles. A strong Spanish garrison held New Orleans. New Orleans became the most important key to dreams of prosperity among the settlers bunching up in Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, and West Virginia. The town, known as, quote, the Port of Deposit, was the natural gateway for traffic on the immense Mississippi-Missouri River's watershed, draining the interior American forests of the eastern mountains and the western Great Plains. Spaniards and Canadian French traded turns at trying to manage the disposition of the settlement's, quote,
colorful mixture of Canadian backwoodsmen, company craftsmen and troops, convicts, slaves, women of uncertain virtue, and indigents.
While the early colonial administrators struggled to make the port of New Orleans profitable, interior frontier dwellers in the north could not, quote, deposit, unquote, enough bulk product to sustain the demands of the masters back in Europe. Between 1800 and Jefferson's purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803, the Europeans looked for ways to unload or reform the mosquito-infested and cholera-ridden swamps and wilderness far from the homeland. By the date of purchase of Louisiana, former President George Washington had successfully pacified the natives living in most of the upper Mississippi Territory to the river's source in the north woods of the future Minnesota, better known as the Northwest Territory. Anthony Wayne's large and superior trained army had turned the rout at Fallen Timbers on the Wabash into a wide capitulation of many Great Lakes Indian tribes. Their sachems and warrior chiefs conceded defeat before the overwhelming numbers of eastern settlers followed the Continental Army westward toward the setting sun. So the Greater West awaited settlement. At the beginning of the 19th century, early frontiersmen, hunters, and men of the woods sought solitude in the face of the unsettling confinement of expanding settlements. Boone, Crockett, and other standouts in the Indian and Eastern political wars, addressed in previous chapters, drifted west. Pittsburgh, Marietta, Lexington, Natchez, St. Louis were the staging ground for shipment of people, animals, flour, and whiskey into the Midwest and Mid-South territories. New Orleans, with the Louisiana Purchase, guaranteed these flows continued across the Gulf of Mexico to the world. And by 1800, people were lining the Mississippi's eastern valleys looking to a vast unknown territory across the river. Some frontiersmen and women were already disgruntled and alarmed by the growing density of settler neighbors. They sought more opportunity to commune with the nature that they had known. Boone went to Missouri, Crockett to Texas, and many like them crept cautiously onto the mudflats of the Missouri River and onto the plains beyond. Jefferson's Corps of Discovery, led by Lewis and Clark, gifted a vast territory of plains and mountains that few Easterners had any inkling of. Indians were there already, however, and some far-flung trappers and hunters, mostly French, were also there. Vast herds of buffalo still roamed there. It should be mentioned that French settlers and traders already had penetrated the edges of Spanish soil throughout the 18th century, even to the Rocky Mountains. Voyeurs or chasseurs were particularly interested in securing mining opportunities as far west as Spanish New Mexico. Most Indian tribes tolerated the visitors, but the Apache apparently blocked easy access further west. By the time Lewis and Clark entered the Mandan Indian villages of the Dakotas in 1804, French adventurers had already been there. The turn of the Americans themselves was about due by 1800. President Thomas Jefferson sought to sweep away the British, French, and Spanish stragglers and agitators and to pursue a larger American organized enterprise. as written by F.J. Turner in The Old West.
It was the southern Piedmont that furnished leaders for the southwestward movement in succeeding generations. Among this moving mass, as it passed along the valley into the Piedmont in the middle of the 18th century, were Daniel Boone, John Sevier, James Robertson, and the ancestors of John C. Calhoun, Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, James K. Polk, Sam Houston, and Davy Crockett, while the father of Andrew Jackson came to the Piedmont at the same time from the coast. Recalling that Thomas Jefferson's home was in this frontier, at the edge of the Blue Ridge, we perceive that these names represent the militant, expansive movement in American life. They foretell the settlement across the Alleghenies in Kentucky and Tennessee, the Louisiana Purchase, the Lewis and Clark's transcontinental exploration, the conquest of the great Gulf Plains of the War of 1812 to 15, the annexation of Texas, the acquisition of California, and the Spanish Southwest. They represent, too, frontier democracy in its two aspects, personified by Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. It was a democracy responsive to leadership, susceptible to the waves of emotion of a, quote, high religious voltage, quick and direct in action.
At the Treaty of Greenville, attended by Mad Anthony Wayne, the Grand Sachem of the Wyandots, a more than 6-foot-tall tarhe, also called the Crane, and the Wyandots of Sandusky were influential in persuading at least 12 tribes to sign the treaty. At the last arose Tarhe to make a final appeal to everyone, native and foreign.
Father, listen to your children here assembled. Be strong now, and take care of all your little ones. See what a number you have suddenly acquired. Be careful of them, and do not suffer them to be imposed upon. Don't show favor to one, to the injury of any. An impartial father equally regards all his children, as well those who are ordinary as those who may be more handsome. Therefore, should any of your children come to you crying and in distress, have pity on them and relieve their wants.
You gotta walk that lonesome valley. You gotta walk it by yourself. No one here can walk it for you. You gotta walk it by yourself. When the Lord says Jesus calling, I'm away for him gotta walk it by yourself. Well, some say that Johnny was a Baptist, and others say